Thank you for sharing the text. Here's the deep, nuanced rewrite based on your instructions. Thank you for joining us as we explore this week's episode of Into the Killing. If you've listened to previous episodes, you're aware that our focus is on uncovering intriguing cold cases. Stories that remained unsolved for years but eventually found resolution. Our podcast and YouTube channel emphasize a broad spectrum of true crime stories, seeking out cases with compelling twists and unresolved mysteries. On our paranormal platform, we delve into the strange and unexplained, sharing tales of ghosts, monsters, and extraterrestrial encounters that continue to captivate and mystify. If you have a case you'd like us to investigate, you can suggest it through our website, kremlinlist.com. For this episode, we rewind to January of 1975. On the 5th day of that month, actor Bradley Cooper was born in Baked Township, a suburb near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. From an early age, Cooper developed a passion for acting, making his television debut in 1999 with a minor role in HBO's Sex and the City. A few years later, he appeared in his first film, the ensemble comedy The Wedding Crashers. That same year marked his transition to the big screen with a supporting part in the cult favorite Wet Hot American Summer. Cooper's early career also included a recurring role in the acclaimed ABC series Alias, where he was a regular for the first 2 seasons before making guest appearances in seasons 3 and 5. A significant breakthrough came when he played the antagonist in the comedy Wedding Crashers. However, his true rise to international stardom happened in 1999 with the release of The Hangover, a comedy that cemented his status among Hollywood's top actors. Over the years, he has received 11 nominations for the Academy Awards and has won 2 Grammy Awards, highlighting his versatility as an artist. The very next day, on January 6, 1975, television history was made with the debut of Wheel of Fortune on ABC. Created by media mogul Merv Griffin, who was also behind Jeopardy! The show originally aired during daytime hours. It was hosted by Chuck Woolery and Susan Stafford, with its memorable theme song composed by Alan Thicke, who later gained fame as an actor. The iconic evening edition of the show, hosted by Pat Sajak alongside Vanna White, premiered in September of the following year, transforming the landscape of game shows and becoming a beloved television fixture. Since its debut 48 years ago on January 15, 1975, the television game show Wheel of Fortune has consistently captivated audiences around the world. Meanwhile, in Florida's Tomorrowland at Disney World, Space Mountain opened its doors, adding a new thrill to the park. Originally conceived by Walt Disney in 1959, the indoor roller coaster faced technical hurdles that delayed its construction. By the early 1970s, Disney aimed to replicate the iconic Matterhorn bobsleds from Disneyland in California, but logistical challenges prevented that plan, paving the way for Space Mountain's realization. Notably, it was designed as the first roller coaster entirely shrouded in darkness, heightening the element of surprise as riders couldn't anticipate turns or drops. Since its debut, Space Mountain has gained immense popularity, leading to its duplication across all Disney parks worldwide, except Shanghai Disneyland Resort. Rumors persist that the Disney World version is haunted, a topic we'll explore in an upcoming video on our paranormal-themed channel. On the charts, January 26, 1975, the top song was Neil Sedaka's Laughter in the Rain. while the box office hit was Murder on the Orient Express, adapted from Agatha Christie's renowned novel. In that same month, 22-year-old Teresa Clark, a graduate student at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, was studying speech pathology and audiology. Born in Lamont, Illinois, she was one of 5 siblings and shared an off-campus apartment in Carbondale with a roommate. On the final weekend of January, while her roommate was away, Clark returned home on Sunday the 27th and was met with a horrifying scene. Blood splattered throughout the apartment revealed the grim discovery. Clark lay in the bathtub, submerged in water, her body brutally stabbed multiple times in the chest and sexually assaulted. The police found no signs of forced entry, suggesting she knew her attacker, who likely murdered her in the living room before dragging her body into the bathroom, possibly attempting to erase evidence by submerging it. Investigators interviewed her friends and neighbors, learning that the last confirmed sighting of Clark was on Saturday afternoon, January the 26th, leading them to believe she was murdered later that evening. Her parents mentioned she always kept her door locked, hinting that she might have willingly let her killer inside. Several items, including a kitchen knife, a bathrobe, an inexpensive camera, an ashtray, and some school papers, were missing from the apartment. Authorities suspected that her familiarity with her surroundings could indicate that she knew her attacker, or at least felt safe enough to open the door to him. The motive behind the murder appeared to be a robbery, prompting the police to investigate the case thoroughly. They collected some evidence, including fingerprints, and sent them to the FBI for analysis. Despite these efforts, no progress was made, and the investigation stalled. The murder weapon itself was never recovered from the scene, leaving uncertainty about whether the missing knife had actually been used in the killing. Several months passed without any breakthroughs, and eventually the case went cold. Now, let's pause to share a message from our sponsor, Babel. If you're planning an upcoming summer trip abroad, I recommend Babel as your essential travel companion. Whether you're an experienced traveler or venturing abroad for the first time, effective communication is vital for immersing yourself in a new culture. Babbel offers a user-friendly language learning app that has sold over 10 million subscriptions. Its engaging, bite-sized lessons make learning a new language fun and accessible. There's still time to pick up a new language before you leave, and personally, I've been studying Dutch. By summer's end, I hope to test my skills in the Netherlands, confidently reading menus to avoid ordering pickled herring or farm boys, dark raisins soaked in sugary syrup and brandy. Babbel provides access to 14 languages, making it suitable for everyone since its lessons only take about 10 minutes. With consistent practice, you can start conversing in just 3 weeks. Unlike other apps that rely on artificial intelligence, Babbel's lessons are created by over 150 language experts and voiced by authentic native speakers, ensuring real-world applicability. Their method is proven effective, and I can attest to its success firsthand. Babbel also uses advanced speech recognition technology to help improve pronunciation and accent. Besides lessons, users can explore podcasts, games, videos, stories, and even live classes, offering diverse ways to learn. Best of all, there's a 20-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free. Begin your language learning journey today at Babbel, where you can save up to 55% on your subscription by visiting Babbel.com. In July of 1976, Kathleen McSherry, a young student aged 24, was studying administrative science at Southern Illinois University Carbondale. She had recently transferred to the school from Western Illinois University and had been living off campus with a roommate for about a month. Originally from the Chicago area, Kathleen had a brother and a sister. On the night of July 12th, her roommate left the house around 10 o'clock. When he returned the next morning at about 6:12, he discovered Kathleen's lifeless body in her bedroom. She was naked and covered in blood, having been brutally stabbed in the chest and back with a knife estimated to be between 4 and 6 inches long. The weapon was never found, and the victim had also been sexually assaulted. Interestingly, there were no signs of forced entry or break-in, implying she might have known her attacker or let someone inside. Investigators spoke with neighbors, one of whom reported hearing screams and barking around 4:30 in the morning, adding a disturbing layer to the case. In the early 80s, a series of brutal murders shook the community, each grim in its own way. The authorities quickly suspected that the killing of Kathleen McSherry had occurred around the time she was last seen, leading investigators to believe that someone who knew her intimately was responsible. It was thought that McSherry might have been murdered inside her home late at night, perhaps after finding an unlocked window or door, since the killer seemingly entered unnoticed. The police linked her murder to that of Teresa Clark, another young woman, both of whom were students at the local university. Clark, in her early 20s, was sexually assaulted and stabbed to death in her apartment while her roommate was away. Both cases prompted the authorities to identify a suspect, John Paul Phillips, a 23-year-old handyman known for having a volatile temper. Living just across the hall from Clark and only a few blocks from McSherry, Phillips was considered a person of interest because he had verbally threatened both women shortly before their murders. Despite these suspicions, no concrete evidence connected him to the crimes, and the investigation into both murders eventually stalled, going cold. Years later, the violence appeared to have ended, but tragedy struck again on November 10, 1981. Joan Weatherall, a 30-year-old woman working as a cocktail waitress at a Holiday Inn near Southern Illinois University Carbondale, vanished without a trace. Weatherall, a former university student and one of 4 sisters, had grown up in the Chicago area. That night, after finishing her shift, she intended to meet friends but left the hotel around 1 a.m. Yet she never arrived. Her friends thought she might have been too tired and assumed she had gone home. The next morning, her body was discovered in a pond outside Elkville, Illinois. Weatherall's hands had been tied, though the binding device had been removed, and she had been struck on the head with a blunt object, most likely a hammer. She died from asphyxiation, and the police had no suspects or leads, leading the case to go cold. Authorities did not initially believe her murder was connected to the earlier slayings of Clark and McSherry. By late summer of 1981, 21-year-old Susan Shumake from Chicago Heights prepared to begin her senior year at SIUC, majoring in radio and television. She had returned to campus shortly before the semester started and had secured a job at the university's radio station. On August the 17th, she went out for dinner with a friend but never returned, prompting her roommate to report her missing early the next morning. As the hours passed, police scoured the campus and nearby footpaths. Tragically, in the early hours of the following day, an officer noticed trampling in the brush along a shortcut used by students. Venturing into the high grass, they discovered Susan Shumake's body. She was partially nude, and medical examiners determined that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Evidence found at the scene included 2 hairs, but no immediate suspect or clear connection to previous murders arose. The case remained unresolved, illustrating a chilling streak of violence that haunted the community for years. The police conducted a thorough search of the area and discovered Susan's backpack, though her wallet was missing. Inside her wallet, she typically kept about $10, but it was absent. Near her body, investigators found a toiletry bag containing a prescription bottle bearing the name Daniel Willison. Through questioning, authorities learned that Willison was a 21-year-old handyman employed at an apartment complex about a quarter-mile from the crime scene. Recently released from jail for burglary and currently on parole, Willison claimed to have an alibi for the time of the murder, stating he had been with a friend. However, the police were unable to verify this, and the friend remained unlocated. The following day, Willison provided hair samples to the police, but shortly after, he disappeared. When authorities searched his room, they found a strange note, torn into several pieces, some submerged in the toilet, others discarded in the trash. The detectives painstakingly reassembled the torn sections, and the note read, in part, "I don't know why, it's always me. I know I can't handle prison again. I believe everyone would be better off without me. My biggest regret is hurting my family." Initially, investigators thought it might be a suicide note, but as they examined further, they ruled out Willison as a suspect based on hair analysis. Comparing his hair to the strands found on the victim, they determined there was no match, leading them to consider another person of interest. Another suspect was John Paul Phillips, who was then working on a construction project at the campus. His hair was also compared to the fibers found on the victim, but was not a match, so he was not detained. Many people believed that the same individual who murdered Teresa Clark and Kathleen McSherry was responsible for Susan Shumake's death, and they suspected Phillips might be linked to those cases as well. In January of 1982, John Paul Phillips was arrested after he attacked a couple camping in the woods. He tied the man to a tree, pistol-whipped him, and raped the woman, who managed to escape and seek help. She recognized Phillips from their school days. Later that day, he was charged with rape and attempted kidnapping, among other offenses. In February of 1983, Phillips stood trial, found guilty on all counts, and was sentenced to 45 years in prison. By May of 1984, he was sharing a cell with a man named Thomas McHabe. During their conversations, Phillips broached his crimes, claiming to have murdered John Wetherall, Kathleen McSherry, and Teresa Clark. In June of that year, Phillips was released from prison and immediately approached the authorities, recounting details of the murders. His account was inconsistent with rambling explanations for McSherry and Clark's deaths, but when he described Wetherall's murder, he provided specific details. Police recognized that these details could only have been known to the actual killer. For example, Phillips admitted that Wetherall's body had been transported to a pond in a car, a crucial piece of information. In an investigation, police discovered a car with evidence that included 28 strands of hair, 3 from a head and 1 pubic hair, found in the back seat and trunk. All the hairs were linked to the same individual, though whether they belonged to one person remained uncertain. By April of 1986, 32-year-old John Paul Phillips faced murder charges for the killing of Joan Weatherall, leading to a trial that commenced in September of that year. During the proceedings, Thomas McCabe emerged as the key witness. The trial extended over 2.5 weeks, culminating in the jury's verdict after nearly 9.5 hours of deliberation. Phillips was convicted of murder. In November of 1986, Phillips underwent a sentencing hearing. During this session, McCabe testified again, and Phillips, attempting to threaten him, tried to fire a small, homemade zip gun, which malfunctioned. In his desperation, Phillips hurled a metal tube at McCabe. Authorities had to restrain him, and the hearing was temporarily recessed as proceedings continued. At one point, Phillips spat in the face of the Assistant Attorney General. Ultimately, he was condemned to the death penalty. Once sentenced to die, prosecutors chose not to pursue further charges related to other suspected murders, although many suspected he was responsible for the deaths of Teresa Clark, Kathleen McSherry, and Susan Shumake. Phillips did not receive lethal injection. He died of natural causes in prison at the age of 40 in 1993. However, 7 years later, advances in DNA analysis, specifically polymerase chain reaction, PCR, testing, became available. This technique allows scientists to amplify tiny DNA samples, enabling the creation of detailed profiles from minimal evidence. While the blood evidence from Susan Shumake's case was suitable for testing, the samples linked to Teresa Clark and Kathleen McSherry had degraded too much to yield usable DNA. In October of 2001, authorities exhumed John Paul Phillips's remains in Carbondale to obtain a DNA sample from his femur. When compared to DNA from Shumake's case, the results were a disappointment. There was no match. This was especially upsetting to Susan Shumake's family. Nonetheless, police remained hopeful because they had another suspect, Daniel Wilson. A toiletry bag containing Wilson's prescription bottle was discovered near the crime scene, and he lacked an alibi for the time of the murders. Further suspicion arose when Wilson vanished the day after being questioned by police. In a subsequent search of his room, investigators found what appeared to be a suicide note, yet Wilson had not died. In fact, he was living in New Boston, Michigan, working at an auto salvage yard. He was divorced and had one child. The police attempted to interview Wilson but received no cooperation. He refused to provide a DNA sample, which hindered progress. The authorities had still collected hair from Willow Sand, found in 1981, but none of these samples matched the crime evidence, primarily because the hair lacked roots necessary for DNA testing at that time. Without sufficient evidence, they could not secure a warrant for Wilson's DNA sample. Later, investigators learned Wilson had recently sold his car. They spoke to the new owner, who mentioned cigarette butts left in the vehicle's ashtray, which had been there when Wilson sold the car. Since Wilson was known to be a smoker, police considered this detail significant in their ongoing investigation. In the process, investigators collected cigarette residues and submitted them for DNA analysis. A DNA profile was generated and compared to evidence left at the crime scene, resulting in a match. This led to the questioning of Wilson. To progress the case, detectives used a clever tactic. They claimed Ving's backpack, which was yellow, placed Wilson near the scene of the crime. They also asserted that Wilson's fingerprints were found on the backpack. Neither statement was true, but they served their purpose. Wilson then admitted he had stolen only $10 from the backpack. a confession that prompted them to obtain a DNA sample from him, which conclusively matched the evidence at the crime scene. 45-year-old Daniel Wilson was formally charged with murder. His trial took place in March of 2006, 25 years after Susan Shumake's death. The proceedings lasted 4 days, and the jury deliberated less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilt. A month later, Wilson was sentenced to 40 years in prison. His conviction left unresolved 2 earlier cases, the murders of Teresa Clark and Kathleen McSherry. Conventional wisdom pointed to John Paul Phillips, who had confessed to his cellmate, Thomas McCabe, that he had killed them. However, police investigations had shown that the situation was far more complex, and nothing should be accepted at face value. In murder cases, assumptions frequently prove false, and new evidence can dramatically change the narrative. The world had changed significantly since 1975, when Clark and McSherry were murdered. That year's blockbuster films included Jaws, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Shampoo. The most popular songs featured Love Kills by Freddie Mercury, Rhinestone Cowboy by Glenn Campbell, and Elton John's Philadelphia Freedom. Iconic books from 1975 included the young adult classic Tuck Everlasting, Larry McMurtry's family drama, Terms of Endearment, and Stephen King's vampire tale, Salem's Lot. Several innovative products debuted, such as the Betamax video recorder, guacamole-flavored snacks, and the infamous Pet Rock. Also introduced that year was a new culinary sensation, cookies, and novelty items like Pop Rocks and Miller Lite beer. Fast forward 33 years to 2008, and the cultural landscape had shifted once again. The year's top movies included The Dark Knight, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and the animated film Kung Fu Panda. Top hit songs were Low by Flo Rida, featuring T-Pain, Bleeding Love by Leona Lewis, and No One by Alicia Keys. Popular young adult books featured the first Hunger Games, the fourth Twilight novel, Breaking Dawn, and Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. Technological advances brought new devices like Apple's MacBook Air, Nintendo's DSi, and Hollister's lingerie line. Food trends embraced brewed kombucha, McDonald's McDoubles, and summer cider drinks. In 2008, the police revisited the cold case of the 2 young women. The case had last been examined in 2001, but DNA evidence then was too degraded to yield answers. Since the original murders, a groundbreaking technique called mini-short tandem repeat sampling, mini-STR, was developed. This advanced method allows experts to obtain DNA profiles from minute traces of genetic material, increasing identification capabilities 100-fold compared to earlier methods. Although technically complex, its effectiveness revolutionized forensic science. Using mini-STR, the Illinois State Police Laboratory was able to produce DNA profiles from evidence from both crime scenes. They became the first law enforcement agency to utilize this technique successfully. The results confirmed long-held suspicions. John Paul Phillips was indeed a serial killer responsible for the deaths of Teresa Clark and Kathleen McSherry. After over 3 decades, these cold cases were finally solved. At the time of this writing, Daniel Wilson, now aged 63, is serving time at the Quality Life Skills Reentry Center in Kewanee, Illinois. He is eligible to request parole beginning in September. Thank you for listening to this overview of these unresolved and now finally resolved cases. illustrating how advancements in forensic science continue to bring justice after so many years. This concludes our updates for the week. Thank you for staying with us and listening. Please prioritize your safety and well-being during these times. Take good care of yourself, and until next time,